December 19, 1944. Somewhere in the snow-covered Ardennes forest, Belgium. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and gunpowder through the frozen trees. Fresh snow concealed shell craters, abandoned rifles, and the footprints of men who had disappeared into the white silence only hours before. The Battle of the Bulge was still unfolding, and confusion ruled the forest. Patrols crossed paths unexpectedly. Supply columns vanished into the mist. Every movement carried the risk of an ambush. Near a narrow woodland trail, a small German infantry patrol surrounded a lone American soldier who had become separated from his unit during the fighting. Cold, exhausted, and unable to resist further, he was searched according to standard military procedure. German soldiers expected to find ammunition, identification papers, perhaps a map or a field dressing. Those were the ordinary possessions of a frontline infantryman. Instead, one pocket after another revealed an assortment of carefully packed items. Chocolate wrapped against the cold. Cigarettes still dry despite the snow. Water purification tablets. Multiple first aid dressings. A compact sewing kit. Waterproof matches. Extra socks sealed inside protective wrapping. Several maps. A small notebook. Family photographs. Packs of chewing gum. A lightweight can opener designed for field rations. Even spare batteries for a flashlight. None of these objects was a weapon. Yet together they painted a remarkable picture. To many German soldiers, especially those who had spent months fighting with shrinking supplies and increasingly empty depots, the contents of an ordinary American infantryman's pockets reflected something far larger than individual comfort. They hinted at an industrial machine capable of producing not only tanks, aircraft, and artillery, but also millions of small necessities that kept a soldier warm, healthy, fed, and ready to fight day after day. In that frozen forest, the search of one captured GI became more than a routine inspection. It became a quiet glimpse into the vast logistical system standing behind every American uniform, a system that many German officers had already begun to recognize as one of the Allies' greatest weapons. And to understand why such ordinary objects could leave such a lasting impression, we must first step back several years, to the moment when the United States transformed itself into the greatest military supply engine the world had ever seen. Before American soldiers crossed the beaches of Normandy or fought through the forests of Belgium, another battle had already been won thousands of miles from the front. It was fought not with rifles or artillery, but with assembly lines, freight trains, shipyards, and factories that never seemed to sleep. By the time German troops searched the pockets of captured American GIs in late 1944, every object they found represented years of planning, industrial expansion, and an economy transformed for total war. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. Across the Atlantic, many Americans hoped to avoid another European conflict. The memory of the First World War was still fresh, and isolationist sentiment remained strong. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, watched events with growing concern. As Nazi Germany conquered one nation after another, it became increasingly clear that modern warfare demanded resources on a scale never before imagined. Long before American infantry entered combat, the United States began preparing its industries. Automobile manufacturers studied military vehicle production. Steel mills expanded capacity. Chemical companies increased the manufacture of explosives, synthetic rubber, and medicines. Aircraft factories multiplied at astonishing speed. These preparations were not simply about producing more weapons. They were about creating a logistical network capable of sustaining millions of soldiers fighting across multiple continents. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America entered the war fully. Almost overnight, civilian industries shifted toward military production. Automobile assembly lines that had once built family sedans now produced trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles. Refrigerators gave way to aircraft engines. Consumer goods disappeared from factory floors as machinery was redirected toward the demands of war. The scale of this transformation stunned observers around the world. American shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than enemy submarines could sink them. New aircraft rolled off production lines every few hours. Locomotives hauled endless trains loaded with ammunition, fuel, uniforms, food, and medical supplies toward ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Every link in the chain was carefully coordinated because commanders understood that victories depended not only on battlefield tactics but also on uninterrupted supply. For the American infantryman, this industrial strength appeared in ways both obvious and subtle. A GI did not simply receive a rifle and a helmet. He was issued clothing designed for different climates, waterproof equipment, individual first aid packets, mess gear, extra socks, protective gloves when available, entrenching tools, can openers, flashlights, batteries, water purification tablets in certain theaters, and carefully packaged rations. Replacement equipment was expected to arrive regularly, allowing worn or damaged items to be exchanged instead of endlessly repaired. The emphasis on logistics reflected lessons learned from earlier conflicts. Military planners knew that cold, disease, hunger, and exhaustion could weaken an army just as effectively as enemy fire. Dry socks reduced trench foot. Adequate food maintained strength during long marches. Reliable medical dressings increased survival after wounds. Even seemingly insignificant items like sewing kits or waterproof matches helped soldiers remain operational under harsh conditions. These were practical tools, not luxuries. Across the battlefield, the situation facing German soldiers grew increasingly difficult as the war progressed. Germany possessed highly capable engineers and produced formidable weapons, but its industrial base faced mounting pressure. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted factories, rail yards, fuel refineries, and transportation networks. Raw materials became harder to obtain. Oil shortages worsened. Replacement equipment often arrived late or not at all. Supply convoys struggled to reach frontline units as Allied aircraft dominated the skies. By 1944, many German divisions experienced chronic shortages of fuel, ammunition, winter clothing, and even basic medical supplies. Equipment varied widely depending on the unit and its location. Elite formations sometimes remained well equipped, while others relied on captured weapons, repaired gear, or outdated equipment kept in service simply because nothing else was available. Soldiers frequently learned to preserve every item they possessed because replacements could not be guaranteed. This growing contrast became increasingly visible whenever the two armies encountered one another. German troops sometimes remarked on the quality of American boots, the abundance of packaged rations, the availability of cigarettes and chocolate, and the seemingly endless supply of replacement clothing. Such observations did not necessarily imply that every American soldier enjoyed perfect conditions. Combat remained brutal, and shortages still occurred, but the overall logistical support available to U.S. forces was striking compared with Germany's increasingly strained supply system. To many German officers, the significance extended far beyond the individual soldier. Every full canteen, every clean bandage, every spare pair of socks suggested that somewhere beyond the battlefield stood an industrial nation capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. The contents of a GI's pockets were only the final link in a supply chain stretching from American farms, factories, warehouses, railroads, and ports across an entire ocean to the frozen forests of Europe. That immense logistical journey would become even clearer when we follow the daily life of an American infantryman, from the moment his equipment was issued to the moment it reached the front lines, where ordinary pocket-sized items quietly reflected one of history's greatest military supply systems. For an American infantryman arriving in Europe during 1944, the war was measured not only in miles marched or battles fought, but in the equipment he carried every single day. Before he ever saw the front line, Army quartermasters carefully issued clothing, weapons, and personal gear according to standardized lists that had been refined through years of combat experience. Every item had a purpose. Together, they formed a system designed to keep one soldier alive, effective, and mobile under the harshest conditions imaginable. The journey of those supplies often began thousands of miles away. Cotton harvested in the American South became uniforms. Leather from Midwestern tanneries was turned into combat boots. Steel from Pennsylvania mills became helmets and entrenching tools. Medical dressings were packed in sterile factories. Food processors filled millions of ration boxes with canned meat, crackers, powdered beverages, coffee, and chocolate. Once inspected, these supplies traveled by rail to coastal ports, where enormous cargo ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. Crossing the ocean was itself a dangerous mission. German U-boats prowled the sea lanes, hoping to cut the flow of Allied supplies before they reached Europe. Convoys, protected by destroyers, escort carriers, and patrol aircraft, sailed through storms and submarine-infested waters. Every successful crossing represented another shipment of fuel, ammunition, food, clothing, and replacement equipment reaching Allied armies. By 1944, improved convoy tactics and growing naval superiority had dramatically reduced German success, allowing an almost continuous stream of supplies to reach Britain and, after D-Day, the European mainland. Once unloaded, the work was far from over. Engineers repaired damaged ports, constructed temporary harbors, and laid pipelines to move fuel inland. Railway crews restored bombed tracks while thousands of trucks carried supplies forward in an uninterrupted flow. One of the most famous transportation efforts was the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system created after the Normandy landings. Day and night, drivers delivered ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment to rapidly advancing Allied forces. Many of the soldiers behind the wheel endured exhausting schedules, often driving without headlights to avoid enemy aircraft, yet their work proved just as essential as that of the infantry at the front. By the time a crate reached a frontline supply depot, countless hands had already contributed to its journey. Quartermasters sorted and distributed equipment with remarkable efficiency. Damaged boots could often be exchanged. Torn uniforms replaced. Empty ammunition pouches refilled. Medical stations received fresh bandages, plasma, and medicines. Kitchens prepared hot meals whenever circumstances allowed, while field rations ensured soldiers could continue fighting even when regular cooking became impossible. The American GI's pockets reflected this carefully organized system. Inside might be a first aid packet carried for immediate treatment after injury. Waterproof matches could help start a fire under difficult conditions. A compact can opener allowed access to canned rations. Chewing gum helped relieve thirst and stress during long patrols. Extra socks, though easily overlooked, reduced the risk of trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions that had disabled thousands of soldiers in earlier wars. Even small sewing kits enabled quick repairs that kept uniforms functional in the field. Not everything carried by an American soldier came from official issue. Personal letters from home were treasured possessions, often folded carefully into shirt pockets or stored inside waterproof envelopes. Black and white family photographs reminded men why they were fighting. Small religious medals, pocket Bibles, lucky coins, or handwritten notes frequently accompanied them into combat. These personal items held no military value, yet they offered comfort during moments of uncertainty and fear. German soldiers also carried deeply personal belongings, but by the later years of the war, many noticed a growing contrast in practical supplies. Veterans later recalled seeing captured American cigarettes in abundance, individually packaged medical supplies, and food items that remained sealed against moisture. Some German troops were surprised by the quantity of spare items carried by individual GIs, especially during periods when their own units struggled with shortages of clothing, batteries, or replacement equipment. These observations varied from unit to unit and should not be exaggerated, but they reflected a broader reality. The logistical situations of the two armies had increasingly diverged. By late 1944, Germany's transportation network had been battered by sustained Allied bombing. Fuel shortages forced difficult choices about where supplies could be sent. Rail lines were repeatedly disrupted, bridges destroyed, and truck fleets hampered by a lack of gasoline. Even when factories continued producing equipment, delivering it to frontline formations became an ever greater challenge. Meanwhile, Allied logistical organizations, though not without problems of their own, generally maintained a level of supply unmatched by any other military force of the war. This difference shaped battlefield performance in countless invisible ways. A soldier with dry socks marched farther. A wounded man with immediate first aid had a better chance of survival. Reliable batteries kept flashlights and radios functioning during critical hours. Nutritious rations preserved strength through long campaigns. None of these items won battles by themselves, but together they increased the endurance and effectiveness of an entire army. So when German troops searched the pockets of a captured American GI, they were seeing more than one man's possessions. They were seeing the final expression of a vast industrial network stretching across an ocean, a network that supplied millions of soldiers with astonishing consistency despite the enormous demands of global war. Yet equipment alone never tells the whole story. To understand why these seemingly ordinary objects left such an impression, we must look at them from different perspectives, through the eyes of the soldiers who carried them, the doctors who relied on them, the commanders who planned around them, and the enemy who encountered them on the battlefield. The objects tucked into an American infantryman's pockets rarely attracted attention during training. They were issued, checked, packed, and carried almost automatically. But once combat began, each of those small items could become unexpectedly important. What appeared ordinary in a supply depot often became invaluable in a frozen foxhole or a ruined village under artillery fire. Looking at those objects individually reveals why they represented far more than simple convenience. The first perspective is survival. Every experienced infantryman understood that the battlefield threatened him long before he encountered the enemy. Rain-soaked uniforms, snow-froze boots, mud-clogged weapons. Nights without shelter drained strength faster than long marches. American field manuals emphasized preparation because surviving the environment was often the first challenge. A GI typically carried equipment intended to solve dozens of small problems before they became life-threatening. A field dressing could slow severe bleeding until a medic arrived. Waterproof matches allowed a fire to be started when weather permitted. An entrenching tool helped dig protective positions within minutes of reaching new ground. Extra socks, carefully wrapped to keep them dry, reduced the risk of trench foot after days spent marching through wet terrain. Even a small sewing kit allowed torn clothing or damaged web gear to be repaired without waiting for replacement supplies. German soldiers carried many similar essentials whenever available, but by late 1944 shortages increasingly affected what reached frontline units. Supplies that had once been routine sometimes became difficult to replace. Veterans later described carefully preserving worn equipment because new issues could not always be expected. In contrast, many American units generally anticipated regular resupply, allowing soldiers to focus more on fighting than on conserving every piece of equipment. Another revealing perspective came from food. Hunger had shaped military history for centuries, and commanders knew that an underfed army quickly lost its effectiveness. The American Army invested enormous effort into developing field rations that balanced nutrition, durability, and portability. Different ration types were designed for different situations, from prepared meals to compact emergency packs carried during combat. The care ration, introduced for mobile troops, packed canned meat, biscuits, powdered beverages, chewing gum, cigarettes for those who used them, matches, toilet paper, and a small can opener into compact cartons. It was never intended as a permanent diet, yet it allowed soldiers to remain operational when kitchens could not reach the front. The larger C-ration provided more substantial canned meals and became familiar to countless American infantrymen throughout the European campaign. German forces also issued field rations, and early in the war they were generally adequate. However, as Allied bombing intensified and transportation networks deteriorated, food distribution became increasingly uneven. Soldiers at the front sometimes received reduced portions or relied on whatever local supplies could be obtained. Captured Allied rations were therefore welcomed by many German troops, not necessarily because they were luxurious, but because they were dependable, sealed against the elements, and immediately usable. The contents of an American GI's pockets often reflected this careful planning. A chocolate bar supplied quick energy during exhausting marches. Chewing gum helped relieve dry mouths and stress. Coffee packets offered warmth and familiarity whenever hot water was available. None of these items appeared remarkable in isolation. Together, however, they demonstrated a military system that recognized morale and nutrition as practical components of combat effectiveness. A third perspective centered on medicine. During the Second World War, advances in battlefield medical care dramatically improved survival compared with earlier conflicts. Every American soldier carried an individual first aid packet intended for immediate use after injury. Medics followed closely behind advancing units, while evacuation systems moved wounded men through aid stations toward increasingly sophisticated hospitals. By 1944, antibiotics such as penicillin were becoming more widely available to Allied forces, complementing blood plasma, improved surgical techniques, and better infection control. Not every wounded soldier could be saved, but the chances of survival had improved significantly. Immediate treatment often made the difference between life and death, and the small medical supplies carried by individual infantrymen formed the first link in that chain. German military medicine remained highly professional and capable, yet it increasingly operated under severe logistical constraints as the war progressed. Shortages of transportation, medical materials, and fuel complicated evacuation efforts, particularly during the final year of the conflict. The contrast was not always visible from a distance, but it became apparent whenever soldiers compared the equipment they carried or the resources available to treat the wounded. Seen through the lenses of survival, food, and medicine, the contents of a captured GI's pockets were no longer a collection of random objects. They revealed an army that sought to prepare its soldiers for countless challenges beyond enemy fire. Each item represented planning, manufacturing, transportation, and experience gathered across years of global conflict. Yet even these practical necessities tell only part of the story. Some of the most revealing items were not meant to preserve life at all. They preserved identity, morale, and purpose, and they offered German soldiers an even deeper glimpse into the world that stood behind every American uniform. While practical equipment helped an American soldier survive, other items carried no direct combat value at all. They could not stop a bullet, destroy a tank, or win a battle. Yet when German troops searched captured GIs, these personal possessions often revealed something equally important: the human side of an army fighting thousands of miles from home. Mixed among ammunition, rations, and medical supplies were reminders of families, ordinary life, and a nation capable of sustaining not only its soldiers' physical needs but also their morale. One of the most common discoveries was paper. Folded carefully inside waterproof wallets or tucked into breast pockets were handwritten letters from parents, wives, siblings, or sweethearts. Some were read dozens of times until the edges wore thin. Others had arrived only days earlier through the remarkably efficient Allied military postal system, which handled millions of pieces of mail every week. For men enduring artillery bombardments, freezing temperatures, and constant uncertainty, these letters served as emotional lifelines. They reminded soldiers that another world still existed beyond the shattered villages and forests of Europe. Family photographs carried similar importance. Small black and white portraits of children, spouses, parents, or hometown friends accompanied countless American soldiers into battle. These photographs occupied almost no space, yet they represented everything the war was meant to protect in the minds of many who carried them. German soldiers carried similar keepsakes of their own, creating a quiet reminder that despite fighting on opposite sides, ordinary men often clung to the same deeply personal connections. Another category of pocket contents reflected the importance the U.S. Army placed on navigation and communication. Waterproof maps, notebooks, pencils, and compasses were frequently issued or carried according to a soldier's role. Officers and non-commissioned officers relied heavily on maps to coordinate movements, while ordinary riflemen often kept locally issued maps or sketches that helped them understand unfamiliar terrain. Small notebooks contained grid references, passwords, patrol schedules, supply notes, or simple reminders written during moments of relative calm. To an enemy searching these items, they could provide useful intelligence, but they also demonstrated the emphasis American forces placed on organization and decentralized decision-making. Money was another item that occasionally surprised German troops. American soldiers often carried military payment certificates or local occupation currency depending on the theater of operations. While not intended for combat, these funds allowed troops to purchase goods when circumstances permitted or interact with civilian populations under military regulations. Combined with personal identification papers, photographs, and official documents, such items painted a picture of an army operating within a vast administrative system that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. Morale items also occupied an important place in American military life. Cigarettes were widely included in ration packs during much of the war and were considered an ordinary part of daily issue for those who smoked. Chocolate bars, instant coffee, chewing gum, and hard candy provided brief moments of comfort during exhausting campaigns. Today these items may seem insignificant, but for soldiers who had spent days in freezing foxholes or muddy defensive positions, small comforts could lift spirits in ways difficult to measure. German veterans later recalled that captured American rations and cigarettes were often welcomed whenever they became available, especially as shortages within Germany grew more severe during the final stages of the war. Perhaps the most revealing perspective came from the observations recorded by German officers, Allied intelligence personnel, and veterans after the war. While accounts varied depending on location and circumstance, a recurring theme emerged. Many German soldiers recognized that the American army possessed an extraordinary logistical system capable of supplying not only weapons and ammunition but also countless small necessities that improved a soldier's endurance and efficiency. Historians caution against sensational stories claiming that Germans were universally astonished by every item they found. Frontline troops on both sides were experienced professionals who understood military equipment well. What often impressed them was not the existence of a particular object but the consistent availability of so many useful items across millions of American soldiers. This distinction is important. The true story is not that a sewing kit, chocolate bar, or first aid packet was individually remarkable. Similar items existed in many armies. The remarkable achievement lay in America's ability to manufacture them by the millions, transport them across an ocean threatened by submarines, distribute them through an immense supply network, and place them reliably into the pockets of soldiers fighting in forests, mountains, beaches, and ruined cities thousands of miles from home. By the winter of 1944, German commanders increasingly understood that they were confronting more than Allied armies. They were confronting the productive capacity of an entire continent-sized nation whose factories, railroads, ports, farms, and merchant fleets worked together with astonishing coordination. Every captured American pocket quietly testified to that reality. Soon, this realization would become impossible to ignore. During one of the largest and most desperate German offensives of the war, thousands of American soldiers would be captured, wounded, or cut off in the snow-covered Ardennes. There, under the harshest conditions imaginable, the contents of their pockets would take on an even greater significance because they represented the difference between an army still capable of sustaining itself and one whose own supply system was beginning to collapse. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 5:30 a.m. The silence shattered without warning. Hundreds of German artillery pieces opened fire almost simultaneously, sending thousands of shells crashing into American positions scattered across the snow-covered hills. Telephone lines snapped. Trees exploded into splinters. Entire crossroads disappeared beneath smoke and flying earth. In the opening minutes of what would become the Battle of the Bulge, confusion spread faster than any official report could follow. The German High Command had launched its final great offensive in the West. Adolf Hitler believed one powerful strike through the Ardennes could split the British and American armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiating peace. The attack relied on surprise, speed, and the hope that Germany could achieve one decisive victory before its remaining resources were exhausted. Facing the assault were American divisions, many of them recovering from months of continuous combat or occupying what had been considered a relatively quiet sector. Some units consisted of battle-hardened veterans. Others included inexperienced replacements who had never faced a major German offensive. Within hours, the front fractured into isolated pockets of resistance. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles, refugees, artillery, ambulances, and reinforcements rushing toward the fighting. Thick forests, deep snow, and poor weather reduced visibility to only a few dozen meters in places. Patrols frequently lost contact with neighboring units. Soldiers who became separated often wandered through unfamiliar woods, uncertain whether the next voices they heard would belong to friends or enemies. As German spearheads pushed westward, they captured a number of American soldiers during local engagements. Standard military procedure followed. Prisoners were disarmed, searched, identified, and questioned whenever possible. The immediate objective was intelligence. Officers wanted maps, written orders, passwords, unit designations, and any information that could reveal Allied dispositions or planned movements. But during these routine searches, German troops repeatedly encountered something else. American soldiers carried an impressive assortment of practical equipment packed into pockets, cartridge belts, musette bags, and field jackets. Besides identification tags and ammunition, searchers often found individually packaged first aid dressings, waterproof matches, compact can openers, notebooks, pencils, spare socks, sewing kits, flashlights with replacement batteries, packets of chewing gum, chocolate, cigarettes, and carefully folded letters from home. None of these discoveries altered the tactical situation by themselves. Yet together they reflected a level of logistical consistency that German soldiers increasingly struggled to match. The contrast became especially noticeable during the bitter winter conditions of the Ardennes campaign. Cold weather punished both armies equally. Temperatures frequently dropped below freezing. Snow-soaked boots during long marches before freezing solid overnight. Frostbite became a constant threat. Vehicles refused to start. Weapons malfunctioned when improperly maintained. Under such conditions, seemingly minor supplies assumed enormous importance. Dry socks could prevent debilitating foot injuries. Waterproof matches preserved the ability to light a warming fire when tactical conditions allowed. A fresh field dressing remained sterile despite snow and mud. A chocolate bar supplied desperately needed calories after hours of exhausting movement through deep snow. German troops understood the value of every one of these items because they faced the same conditions. Many had endured years of increasingly difficult campaigns across the eastern and western fronts. By late 1944, however, replacement clothing, medical materials, batteries, fuel, and food often reached frontline formations in limited quantities or after significant delays. Allied bombing had devastated transportation networks. Fuel shortages restricted vehicle movement. Railways operated under constant attack. Every logistical failure multiplied the hardships experienced by frontline soldiers. Captured American equipment therefore attracted genuine professional interest. It was examined not simply out of curiosity but because it revealed how the enemy supported its infantry. Intelligence officers documented equipment, ration types, medical supplies, maps, and organizational methods. Such examinations were standard practice throughout the war, conducted by all major armies whenever enemy equipment became available. Some German veterans later remarked on the quality and abundance of American field gear. Others noted the dependable packaging of rations or the consistent issue of personal equipment. These observations varied according to individual experience and should not be treated as universal reactions. Yet together they point toward a broader truth recognized by military historians. By the winter of 1944, the logistical gap between the United States and Germany had become impossible to ignore. That realization extended far beyond the individual prisoner standing in the snow. Every captured field dressing suggested factories still operating at full capacity across the Atlantic. Every fresh chocolate bar hinted at secure shipping lanes protected by Allied naval power. Every spare battery implied reliable supplies of raw materials, functioning electrical industries, and transportation systems capable of delivering even the smallest necessities to soldiers fighting hundreds of miles from the nearest major port. For German commanders, these pocket-sized items represented something deeply troubling. They were visible evidence that the enemy's greatest strength might not be found in a single tank, aircraft, or artillery piece, but in the vast industrial machine that continued feeding entire armies despite months of relentless combat. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, this realization would grow even sharper. The offensive that had begun with surprise and optimism would soon collide with the hard limits of Germany's dwindling fuel reserves, damaged transportation network, and exhausted industrial capacity, turning what seemed like a bold gamble into one of the defining moments of the war. The first days of the offensive delivered exactly what the German High Command had hoped for. Several American units were caught off guard, important crossroads fell under pressure, and armored spearheads pushed farther west than many Allied commanders had expected. Dense fog grounded much of the Allied Air Force, allowing German columns to move with a degree of protection they had not enjoyed for months. For a brief moment, it appeared that the gamble might succeed. But beneath the apparent momentum, the offensive carried a weakness that no amount of tactical surprise could erase. Germany had assembled thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and some of its remaining elite formations for the attack. Yet it lacked the fuel reserves to sustain a prolonged advance. Many armored units began the operation with only enough gasoline for the opening stages, expecting to capture Allied fuel dumps as they advanced. The plan depended on speed. Every hour of delay increased the risk that vehicles would simply run out of fuel before reaching their objectives. American resistance, however, proved far more stubborn than German planners had anticipated. Small groups of infantry repeatedly defended villages, bridges, and road junctions far longer than expected. At places like St. Vith and Bastogne, determined defenders forced German columns to divert, regroup, or fight costly engagements that consumed precious time. Engineers demolished bridges. Artillery delayed advancing armor. Even isolated rifle platoons disrupted carefully planned timetables simply by refusing to surrender key positions. Each delay carried consequences measured not only in casualties but also in logistics. Fuel trucks struggled to reach the spearheads. Damaged tanks blocked narrow forest roads. Recovery vehicles lacked the resources to retrieve disabled equipment. Ammunition had to be rationed more carefully as supply columns fell behind. Every kilometer gained stretched the already fragile supply system further from its starting point. Meanwhile, the American logistical network demonstrated remarkable resilience. Although the German breakthrough disrupted roads and temporarily isolated many units, Allied commanders rapidly reorganized transportation routes. Quartermaster personnel established alternate supply points. Engineers repaired damaged bridges while military police redirected endless streams of trucks through newly designated corridors. Medical evacuation continued despite heavy fighting, and replacement ammunition, food, winter clothing, and fuel steadily reached most frontline formations. When the weather finally cleared around December 23, the balance shifted dramatically. The skies above the Ardennes filled with Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers attacked German columns trapped on narrow roads, while transport aircraft dropped desperately needed supplies to encircled American forces defending Bastogne. Fuel depots, bridges, railheads, and vehicle concentrations became targets from dawn until dusk. The logistical problems that had shadowed the German offensive from its beginning now grew into a crisis that battlefield courage alone could not overcome. Captured documents and post-war German accounts reveal how deeply commanders understood the situation. Many officers recognized that their formations were increasingly immobilized not because they lacked trained crews or capable weapons, but because fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts could no longer arrive in sufficient quantities. Tanks that survived enemy fire sometimes had to be abandoned simply because there was no gasoline left to move them. Trucks stood idle while desperately needed supplies waited miles behind the front. Against this backdrop, the seemingly ordinary contents of an American GI's pockets acquired a much larger meaning. A dry pair of socks suggested a supply chain still functioning despite the chaos of battle. A sealed field dressing reflected factories continuing to produce millions of medical items without interruption. A fresh packet of chewing gum, a chocolate bar, or spare flashlight batteries represented more than personal comfort. They demonstrated an industrial economy that could sustain countless small needs while simultaneously manufacturing aircraft, tanks, artillery, ships, and millions of tons of ammunition. Military historians often emphasize that wars are rarely decided by a single dramatic invention or one spectacular battle. More often, victory belongs to the nation capable of consistently replacing losses, maintaining transportation, feeding its troops, and supporting them through months or years of continuous operations. The Battle of the Bulge became one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. Thousands of irreplaceable soldiers had been lost. Hundreds of tanks, assault guns, and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Perhaps most critically, Germany had exhausted reserves of fuel and equipment that it could no longer replace. The offensive intended to reverse the course of the war instead accelerated the weakening of the German army in the West. For the Allies, the victory carried its own heavy price. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and one of the costliest battles ever fought by the United States Army, with tens of thousands killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Entire towns were devastated, forests reduced to splintered wastelands, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. Yet the Allied logistical system endured the shock, recovered, and continued driving eastward. In retrospect, the search of a captured American soldier's pockets was never about a handful of objects. It was about what those objects represented. To a German soldier standing in the frozen Ardennes, they offered a glimpse into the vast network of farms, factories, laboratories, railroads, merchant ships, warehouses, and workers that stood behind every American uniform. That network could absorb losses, replace equipment, and keep moving forward when Germany's own supply system was reaching its breaking point. The final collapse of the Third Reich would not be determined by what was found in one Man's pockets alone, but those small, everyday items quietly symbolized one of the greatest strategic advantages of the Allied war effort, an advantage whose consequences would soon reshape Europe and bring the conflict in the West to its conclusion. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked far more than the end of Germany's last major attack in Western Europe. When the fighting gradually subsided in late January 1945, the battlefield told a story written not only in destroyed tanks and abandoned weapons, but also in empty fuel cans, frozen supply trucks, shattered rail lines, and exhausted soldiers. The offensive had consumed resources that Germany simply could not replace. As German units withdrew eastward, the logistical crisis that had been building for months became impossible to conceal. Fuel remained the most critical problem. Even factories that continued producing tanks or armored vehicles struggled to make them useful because gasoline was increasingly scarce. Synthetic fuel plants had suffered repeated attacks from Allied bombers, while access to natural oil supplies had been severely reduced. A newly manufactured tank without fuel offered little more than static protection. Transportation suffered the same fate. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, Allied strategic bombing had systematically targeted Germany's rail network, bridges, marshalling yards, and repair facilities. Freight trains carrying ammunition, food, and replacement equipment often arrived late or failed to arrive at all. Damaged locomotives sat idle awaiting repairs that became increasingly difficult to complete. Truck convoys faced constant shortages of fuel, spare parts, and serviceable tires. Every interruption forced commanders to make painful decisions about which units would receive priority and which would simply have to endure without adequate supplies. For soldiers at the front, these strategic problems translated into everyday hardships. Winter uniforms wore out without replacement. Medical supplies became harder to obtain. Artillery batteries sometimes limited their fire because ammunition had to be conserved. Mechanics cannibalized damaged vehicles to keep others operational, while infantrymen repaired aging boots, belts, and packs that earlier in the war would likely have been exchanged. These measures reflected ingenuity and determination, but they also revealed an army operating under severe material constraints. Across the front lines, the situation looked markedly different. The Allied advance resumed with extraordinary logistical support. Engineers rapidly restored damaged roads and bridges as armies moved eastward. Quartermaster units established new supply depots almost as quickly as old ones were left behind. Fuel pipelines extended deeper into occupied territory, reducing dependence on long truck convoys. Cargo ships continued arriving from North America carrying fresh equipment, replacement vehicles, food, fuel, clothing, and medical supplies in quantities unmatched by any other combatant nation. To the individual American soldier, much of this vast logistical effort remained invisible. He simply collected replacement boots when his old pair wore out. He received fresh ammunition before major operations. He found medical stations supplied with bandages, plasma, and increasingly available penicillin. Field kitchens resumed serving hot meals whenever tactical conditions allowed. Mail continued to arrive from home, bringing letters and photographs that reminded men of the lives waiting beyond the battlefield. The contrast did not mean American forces escaped hardship. The winter of 1944-45 remained brutally cold. Supply lines occasionally stretched to their limits during rapid advances. Frontline troops still endured hunger, fatigue, fear, and the constant danger of enemy fire. Trucks became stuck in mud. Bridges collapsed under heavy loads. Weather delayed deliveries. Logistics, no matter how efficient, could never eliminate the chaos of war. Yet compared with Germany's deteriorating position, the Allied system retained a remarkable ability to recover from disruption. When one route became unusable, another was organized. When equipment was lost, replacements generally followed. This resilience became one of the defining characteristics of the Allied campaign during the final months of the war. German officers increasingly recognized this imbalance. Post-war memoirs and military studies frequently returned to the same conclusion: American industrial production and logistical organization provided an operational advantage that battlefield tactics alone could not overcome. The issue was not simply that American soldiers carried more items in their pockets. It was that those items could be replaced again and again through a supply network that continued functioning even while armies advanced hundreds of kilometers across Europe. As Allied troops crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and pressed deeper into Germany, this difference became visible everywhere. Abandoned German vehicles lined roadsides, often left behind because they lacked fuel or mechanical support rather than because they had been destroyed in combat. Allied columns, meanwhile, continued moving with an almost uninterrupted flow of fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, ambulances, engineering equipment, and maintenance vehicles close behind. The contents of a captured GI's pockets had never been the decisive factor in the war. But they had served as a small, tangible reflection of something far greater, a logistical system that remained capable of sustaining millions of soldiers across an entire continent. As Germany's military strength steadily eroded during the final months of the conflict, that difference became one of the most important reasons the Western Allies maintained their relentless advance toward the heart of the Third Reich. The fighting would soon end, but historians, veterans, and military analysts would continue examining why one army managed to keep its soldiers supplied while another gradually ran out of the resources needed to continue the struggle. Their conclusions would shape the way future generations understood not only World War II, but the nature of modern warfare itself. The guns fell silent across Europe on May 8, 1945. After nearly 6 years of war, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks had collapsed, and millions of soldiers and civilians had paid an unimaginable price. Yet as historians began studying why the conflict ended as it did, they repeatedly arrived at the same conclusion: victory had depended not only on battlefield courage, but on the ability to sustain that courage with an uninterrupted flow of supplies. When Allied investigators examined captured German records after the war, they found countless reports describing shortages of fuel, transportation, replacement equipment, and trained personnel. Operational plans were frequently shaped not by what commanders wished to accomplish, but by what their dwindling resources allowed. Entire armored formations that appeared formidable on paper often possessed only a fraction of the fuel needed for sustained operations. Rail movements were delayed by bomb damage, replacement vehicles arrived without spare parts, and ammunition allocations became increasingly restricted during the final months of the conflict. The United States Army faced challenges of its own, but its logistical foundation remained fundamentally intact. American factories continued producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, uniforms, boots, medical supplies, and food in extraordinary quantities until the war's end. Merchant fleets maintained a steady bridge across the Atlantic, while engineers and transportation units ensured those supplies reached advancing armies with remarkable consistency. It was a level of industrial coordination that military planners around the world would study for decades. Veterans from both sides often remembered this contrast in surprisingly personal terms. American soldiers frequently recalled how ordinary objects, dry socks after days in freezing weather, a hot cup of coffee delivered to the front, fresh bandages at an aid station, or a long-awaited letter from home, could restore morale during the darkest moments of the campaign. These were not dramatic weapons that appeared in wartime headlines. They were simple necessities that quietly allowed exhausted men to continue fighting. German veterans, meanwhile, sometimes described the increasing difficulty of obtaining those same basic necessities. Many wrote of carefully repairing worn equipment because replacements were uncertain, conserving every liter of fuel, or sharing limited food supplies during the final campaigns. Their experiences differed depending on the unit, location, and stage of the war, but a common theme emerged: maintaining combat effectiveness became increasingly difficult as Germany's industrial and transportation systems deteriorated under relentless military pressure. Military historians have long emphasized that logistics rarely receives the attention given to famous battles or celebrated commanders. Trucks are less dramatic than tanks. Warehouses attract fewer headlines than bombers. Quartermasters seldom become household names. Yet every successful military operation depends on these unseen systems. Without transportation, ammunition never reaches artillery batteries. Without fuel, armored divisions remain motionless. Without food and medicine, even the most disciplined soldiers eventually lose the ability to fight. The contents of an American GI's pockets provide a remarkably clear illustration of this principle. A field dressing represented an entire medical production network. A chocolate bar reflected secure agricultural production, food processing, packaging, and transatlantic shipping. A flashlight battery pointed to functioning electrical industries and reliable distribution systems. Even a simple pencil or notebook spoke to standardized manufacturing and dependable supply channels. Each object was small enough to fit into a pocket, yet each depended on thousands of workers spread across factories, railroads, ports, warehouses, and cargo ships. This is why the title of this story carries deeper meaning than simple curiosity. German troops were not necessarily astonished because they discovered unusual or mysterious objects. Most of the items themselves were familiar. What stood out was the consistency with which American soldiers possessed them, even after months of continuous combat. Those pockets represented an industrial society capable of supporting millions of servicemen with extraordinary efficiency, despite fighting on multiple fronts separated by vast oceans. In many ways, the search of a captured GI became a symbolic encounter between two very different wartime realities. One soldier carried the products of a supply system still expanding despite the demands of global conflict. The other often belonged to an army struggling to preserve what remained of its shrinking resources. That contrast reflected the broader trajectory of the war itself. By the spring of 1945, the outcome was no longer determined solely by battlefield tactics or individual acts of bravery. It had been shaped by years of industrial production, transportation planning, scientific innovation, agricultural output, and the countless civilians whose work rarely appeared in combat photographs. The war was won not only in forests and cities, but also in factories, shipyards, rail depots, and warehouses far from the sound of gunfire. And perhaps nowhere was that enormous, often invisible achievement more quietly expressed than in the ordinary contents of a single American soldier's pockets, small objects that, together, told the story of one of history's greatest logistical triumphs. When museums display the equipment of a World War II infantryman, visitors often pause at the rifle, the helmet, or the ammunition belt. Those are the symbols of combat. Yet scattered beside them are objects so ordinary that they are easy to overlook: a folded letter, a worn photograph, a small first aid packet, a can opener, a sewing kit, a pair of socks, a stick of chewing gum. Individually, they seem insignificant. Together, they tell a far larger story. The contents of a captured American GI's pockets were never a secret weapon, nor did they decide the outcome of a single battle. What they revealed was something much more powerful: the ability of an entire nation to support its soldiers with remarkable consistency across thousands of miles of ocean and battlefield. Behind every field dressing stood a medical factory. Behind every chocolate bar stood farmers, food processors, cargo ships, and warehouse workers. Behind every dry pair of socks stood textile mills, railroads, quartermasters, and an industrial system operating on a scale the world had never witnessed before. For German soldiers fighting through the final months of the war, these ordinary items offered a glimpse of an enemy whose greatest strength was not always visible through a rifle. Scope. It was found in the invisible network that kept millions of soldiers supplied, equipped, and moving forward even after years of relentless fighting. World War II reminds us that victory is rarely shaped by courage alone. Courage matters. Leadership matters. Strategy matters. But none of them can endure without the quiet work of logistics: the factories that never stopped, the ships that crossed dangerous seas, the mechanics who repaired trucks through the night, the railway crews who restored broken lines, and the countless civilians whose names never appeared in history books. In the end, the most revealing story was never about what was hidden inside one American soldier's pockets. It was about what those pockets represented: the combined effort of millions working far from the front, whose unseen labor helped shape the course of history. And sometimes, the smallest objects carried into battle can reveal the greatest truths about how wars are truly won.